with the democratic process on the line. Let's bring in MS Now senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard, our justice and intelligence reporter Ken Dilanian. Nice to have you here next to me, Ken. And former senior advisor to the Biden 2020 campaign, Alencia Johnson, and CT Insider senior data editor and columnist Philip Bump, also with me in studio. Vaughn, starting with you, is this something that the president has been plotting out for a while, and what happens to that panel next?
Right. Ultimately, in order to replace these commissioners, these members, these individuals would have to be nominated by President Trump and then confirmed by the Senate. And I think it's important when you look at this commission, I think it's worth looking at the Federal Elections Commission, which as well, which has just 2 remaining members on it. President Trump hasn't nominated anybody to fill the FEC positions. And so effectively, you have both of these commissions now at a standstill as a result of moves by the President of the United States, without quorums being able to effectively do what these independent agencies, their mission was to do. And the president, according to the Supreme Court, has the ability to move forward with these types of firings. When you look at the impact of this particular commission, you're talking about helping distribution of election funding. You're helping with the distribution. It's not nationalizing. It's not the federalizing of elections. But after the 2000 presidential election, this commission was established to try to help at a national level through the voter mail registration files, to help with help the state and localities move forward. I was talking with Secretary of State out of Arizona, Adrian Fontes, and he said that all this does is inhibit the ability of elections to proceed in their dutiful way. And the question is when the president tries to grab this power of elections, what comes next?
So he could fire Vaughn, but can he hire? Can he pick whoever he wants to replace the people that he's fired now?
They'd have to be Senate confirmed. And until he were to put somebody forward and have them Senate confirmed, what you effectively have is this commission not doing the work that it was originally set up by Congress and intended to do.
The administration is telegraphing very clearly that the Supreme Court paved the way for this. Explain how that happened.
So the president's in charge of the executive branch, but for decades there was a legal theory that Congress could set up these independent boards and commissions and place restrictions and rules on them and allow them to operate quasi-independently from the president. The Supreme Court has thrown that out the window with the Slaughter decision, and it's a victory for the so-called unitary executive theory, the idea that the president runs everything. Congress can't put any rules about who he can hire and who he can fire, and that really empowers him to do what he's been doing, which has been firing civil servants, for example, at the Justice Department, getting rid of people on these boards and commissions. It was a huge enhancement of the power of the presidency, and in this case, it's having real consequences.
And Democrats are displeased, to say the least. Alencia, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer reacted, calling this, quote, a brazen attempt to seize control of our elections before a single vote is cast. He is gutting, he being the president, gutting the independent agency that certifies voting systems and helps election officials run secure elections. Senate Democrats will fight this power grab at every turn. But what can Democrats do at this point? Are they handcuffed to do anything ahead of the midterms?
Yeah, look, this is a tough position to be in, but I think Democrats actually have to use this as not only a messaging strategy, but something that galvanizes their voters in order to actually show up in the election and doing the voter education that needs to be done. I think this is kind of a result, as we know, of Trump's frustration with losing the 2020 election. Democrats did a wonderful job, I think, in COVID, in those circumstances, of actually creating an atmosphere where voters understood how they could use their voices at the ballot box. So this is an organizing opportunity, as well as an opportunity to talk about the fact that the party that keeps talking about election integrity is actually the party that is using every lever to actually not make it accessible for most voters. They are the ones saying that Democrats aren't actually for fair elections. It's actually the call coming from inside their own house. And so Democrats have to use this in a really smart way to organize and educate voters, because honestly, the people power is what we have to lean on going into the midterm elections.
Philip, you know, of course, we saw what happened on January 6th when the president was displeased with the results back then. What happens come the midterms if it seems like things are breaking in the Democrats' favor, what could we see next? Game this out for us.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the EAC firings affect that a whole lot. I think it is very clear, and it was clear even before 2020. People forget in 2018 when Rick Scott was in a close battle for the Senate seat in Florida, Donald Trump leaned in on arguments like, oh, there's fraud in Broward County. I mean, he's been doing this even before, in 2016 when he lost the Iowa caucus, he claimed Ted Cruz cheated, right? Like, he's been doing this a long time. And so I think it is very clear that what the plan here is to, if there are results that he doesn't like in November, which it seems pretty clear there will be given how things are trending, that there will be an effort where possible to try and put pressure on people to change those results. And I think it's really important to remember, too, that when we talk about putting that pressure, look at what happened in Georgia in 2020. It was a very close race. It was all electronic voting machines. It was a Republican-administered state. But he still tried to get them to change what had happened there. And so I think what this does is this particular decision doesn't necessarily make that easier for him, but it does reinforce that his goal in this election cycle is to retain as much power as possible so that he can then potentially affect it.
It reinforces his priorities, which, Vaughn, Trump has been laser focused on the so-called Save America Act. The president and Republicans are marketing it as a voter ID bill. Right now, a bipartisan housing bill, we should mention, which would tackle a lot of this affordability crisis that we're seeing, is gathering dust on Trump's desk. And just this morning, he reiterated he's not going to sign it in protest over the SAVE Act. So, so without a veto, it becomes law at midnight. Remind us what exactly this law would do and why the president would be passing up this opportunity to account for what looks like would be a bipartisan win.
Right. By not signing it, it will go into law. So effectively, the president is just going to stand by his word that he wasn't going to sign it until the Save America Act was pushed through legislatively through Congress, which Republicans, a great many on Capitol Hill, said that they were not going to co-sign onto. And when you're looking at this bipartisan housing bill, it's one that was shepherded through the Senate by the likes of Elizabeth Warren and Tim Scott of South Carolina. And as part of it, it was an understanding, a recognition that across the country, you're looking at millions of, in terms of housing needs. You're looking at mortgage and home prices that have increased over the last decade. And as part of this bill, for example, there was a quickness of the environmental review process to begin construction of housing. There were loans and grants. There were changes legislatively to the production of mass housing opportunities and for construction to move forward at a quicker rate. And so this is the type of legislation that across the aisle was recognized that was a need for Americans as housing costs continue to rise, and one that is perplexed a great many, understanding that people like Caroline Levitt, just a day before the president was initially set to sign it, called one of the most consequential pieces of housing affordability legislation in a century. And yet the president here announcing today that he's going to sit on it and not put his name to it.
It's just about his name, though, just to be clear for our viewers. If the president doesn't sign it, it's just because he doesn't like it, but it doesn't have a material impact if it does become a law.
That's correct. This is going to move forward here. And essentially, the only reason the impact that the president could have had would have been a veto. And what he is choosing not to do is to not veto it, but he's not also putting his name on it. So the bipartisan housing legislation will, in fact, pass.
Well, Philip, what the president is choosing to do at the NATO summit is talk about how American elections are rigged. Let's listen.
If you count the 4 years where we had a rigged election, it was very much into politics then, too. But I spent the first 4 years. I spent 4 years in a little different state.
This is not the first time the president has denigrated our elections process, but what's the impact when you do that on a global stage?
It's a good question. I think by now, all of this is baked into who Trump is understood to be as a leader, right? Europe knows who Trump is. They got to know who he was in the first term, especially in the second term with this, talking about Greenland all the time, the ways in which he's been trying to pressure them on Iran. They know who he is. They know what this rhetoric is. I don't think they like it. I don't think it changes their perception of who he is. I do think it's worth pointing out for the millionth time that what he's saying is nonsense, right? Like, he created this huge economy for people to come up with nonsense claims about 2020 fraud. Like, if there were fraud, there's such an incentive for so many people who have found it and uncovered it. No election has been more investigated than the 2020 election. Nothing resulted, but he keeps talking about it this way because for him, the democracy aspect of it isn't important. The power aspect of it is, and that's how I think Europeans understand.
Why is he talking about this at NATO?
Because he talks about it everywhere. You know, like literally in
Fair.
every conversation he has with anybody, he talks about it. I think that's probably part of it. My guess is he was asked a question there, probably in response to the developments today, but he's always going to say the same thing.
And Ken, just to tie this all in a bow, the Supreme Court has rubber-stamped by partisan gerrymandering. You know, what happens if Trump is unhappy with the way that the midterms shake out, tries to reverse course on the outcomes there? Would the courts, would the DOJ stand in the way?
The DOJ will not only not stand in the way, the DOJ will be there empowering, and there may be FBI agents on the ground participating. That's the great fear. I'm not sure it's going to get to the Supreme Court. That's the worry. Look, the federal government has no role in elections. They shouldn't be at polling places. But if they decide to seize voting machines because Bill Pulte has said there's foreign interference and somebody got a warrant somewhere, the Supreme Court's not going to be able to stop it, at least initially. That's the concern. If there's some kind of contested Senate race and it's coming down to the last few hundred votes, there's a lot of mischief that Trump can make. And unlike in 2020, when everybody at the Justice Department threatened to resign if he did that, this Justice Department will go along. So,
you know, Philip, just for clarity, obviously states are in charge of elections. What does it mean when the president says that he wants to federalize an election? Well, are we seeing the steps and the groundwork of that being laid out now?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. I think the first is telling his base that this is an appropriate thing for the federal government to do, to establish that, of course, we as the federal government should dictate what happens. Of course, this is a break from decades of Republican orthodoxy about how they felt about the 10th Amendment and states' rights and so on and so forth. But I think part of it is simply just a messaging ploy. The second, and the reason for that then is when steps are potentially taken to the extent that, you know, Ken just outlined, they seize these voting machines or whatever it happens to be, that it is then seen as, of course, that is a natural extension of the president's power, which it isn't at all. It is not. It has nothing to do with what the federal government is doing. I think that's most of it. Just clearing the path. I mean, it doesn't really matter because we've seen lots of instances in which he says one thing, does the next thing, and his base goes along with it. But I think it is just to establish, like, I get to do these things and I'm going to do it in the way that I see.